On Saturday, the 4th of August, 1888, a new play opened at the Lyceum Theatre in London, which with hindsight could easily have provided a prelude for the Jack the Ripper murders. The play was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a dramatisation of Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 shilling-shocker, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The actor Richard Mansfield had acquired the stage rights to the novella from Stevenson and had asked aspiring Boston author Thomas Russell Sullivan to adapt it for the theatre. Initially, Sullivan was sceptical that the story would make a good play, but he agreed to collaborate with Mansfield, and their adaptation premiered at the Boston Museum on May 9, 1887, with Mansfield taking on the dual role of the title. Sullivan added several characters to Stevenson's original, most notably a love interest in the form of Jekyll's fiancée, Agnes Carew. The play was enthusiastically received, and, following a brief closure for a rewrite, Mansfield took it on a nationwide tour, ending the run at Madison Square Theatre in New York. Here it was seen by the English actor-manager Henry Irving, who was so impressed by it that he invited Mansfield to bring the production to his theatre, the Lyceum in London. Mansfield agreed and arrived in England in July 1888, where he began working with the Lyceum's acting manager and future author of the novel Dracula, Bram Stoker, to prepare the play for its planned opening in early September. However, a rival and unauthorised version was announced to open on the 6th of August, and so Mansfield brought his opening date forward by a month, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde premiered at the Lyceum on Saturday, the 4th of August, 1888. The first night reviews weren't exactly gushing, but the majority of the critics were highly impressed by Mansfield's onstage metamorphosis from one persona to the other, and were desperate to know the secret of how it had been achieved. The Umpire, in its next day's edition, opined that the play is mediocre as such, but Mr. Mansfield's transformation from one character to the other is most impressive. He gives a philanthropic air to Dr. Jekyll and makes Hyde a perfect fiend. The audience shudders at Hyde's appearance. He crouches and hisses like a veritable wild beast in the murder scene, and he leaps upon his victim like a panther. The performance altogether is a very curious one, and one that it is safe to prophesy will draw large audiences to the Lyceum for some time. The next morning's Times commented, "As Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Mansfield does not strike one as an actor of remarkable resource. Mr. Hyde, however, he plays with a rough vigour or power which, allied to his hideous aspect, thrills the house, producing a sensation composed in equal measure of the morbidly fascinating and the downright disagreeable." That same day's Edinburgh News found the added romantic angle a tad difficult to believe, and questioned whether Mansfield's Dr. Jekyll would be likely to win the heart of any girl. The moody Jekyll himself, with his croakings and his warnings and his laboured melodramatic asides, is about the last person in the world with whom any girl would be likely to fall in love. Mr. Richard Mansfield obviously has his reasons for making Jekyll a bore, chiefly in order to accentuate the character of the Doctor's other self, Mr. Hyde. However, the newspaper did concede that Mansfield's portrayal of Hyde was memorable. The first appearance of this uncanny individual at the window of Sir Danvers Carew's house at night is very striking. He rushes in at the garden door and demands that Sir Danvers shall at once bring forward his daughter. This piece of insolence is naturally resented, and the audience are not likely to forget the ghoulish manner in which Hyde leaps at his victim and with the hiss of a wild cat buries his long claws in the old man's neck and batters the life out of him. The Penny Illustrated Paper's theatre critic, although expressing some reservations about the play's suitability for certain sections of society, was positive about the production's prospects. "It is not a play I should recommend ladies in a delicate state of health to see, but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde will draw the town." Myra's Journal on the 1st of September maintained, "The story is so terrible and the incidents so appalling that it should attract all who have a taste for such things, the majority, we incline to think, of London theatre-goers. The play has no plot. It is something quite different from anything else we have ever witnessed. It is a psychological study, and the interest centres entirely around one character. It is well, therefore, that the actor on whom the onus falls is equal to the task. As Hyde, he is terribly, weirdly horrible. His first appearance as the demon man, distorted in limb and satanic in face, caused a shudder to run through the house. As predicted, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde played to packed audiences at the Lyceum, playgoers largely being drawn by the promise of witnessing Richard Mansfield's masterful and remarkable shift from good to pure evil and back again. And patrons were not disappointed. But as audiences shuddered and shivered and gasped and grimaced at the terrifying display of marrow-chilling wickedness on the Lyceum stage each night, a Hyde-like ghoul surfaced in the miasmic slums of London's East End, and soon the people of the district had their own all-too-real night-time horror to deal with. 3 days after the opening of Jekyll and Hyde, the body of Martha Tabram was discovered in George Yard off Whitechapel High Street. Then, on the 31st of August, Mary Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row off Whitechapel Road. When a week later the murder of Annie Chapman took place in Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, newspapers began wondering if the Whitechapel murders might be the work of a real-life Jekyll and Hyde. The Referee, on Sunday the 9th of September, was one of the first newspapers to suggest that suspicion might fall on Richard Mansfield in some quarters. The upholders of the one-man or foul fiend theory in reality believe that Edward Hyde, or his doubleganger, as they would say in Scotland, is at work in the East End of London. We are accordingly amazed that, among their other luminous suggestions, they do not insist on having a close watch put on the ingenious Mr. Mansfield when he leaves the Lyceum on darksome nights. The next day, the Freeman's Journal conjectured that a Hyde-like character might be at large in the East End. The fact that a woman was the victim in each case, and that she was poor, takes away the suspicion of robbery and suggests some unutterably fiendish motive, such as that which is supposed to animate the mystical character of Hyde in Mr. Stevenson's book. When the devilish nature of Hyde was pictured in the novel, nobody could believe that his prototype could be found in real life. These atrocities, and apparently causeless murders, show that there is abroad at the present time in the East End a human monster even more terrible than Hyde. The Star, on Tuesday the 11th of September, published a letter from what it termed an eccentric correspondent who was of the same opinion. Meanwhile, you and every one of the papers have missed the obvious solution of the Whitechapel mystery. The murderer is a Mr. Hyde who seeks in the repose and comparative respectability of Dr. Jekyll security from the crimes he commits in his baser shape. Of course, the lively imagination of your readers will at once supply certain means of identification for the Dr. Jekyll whose Mr. Hyde seems daily growing in ferocious intensity. If he should turn out to be a statesman engaged in the harmless pursuit of golf at North Berwick, well, you, sir, at least, will be able gratefully to remember that you have prepared your readers for the shock of the inevitable discovery. The Toronto Mail that day wondered at the coincidence of the murders having coincided with Mansfield's production. Such a series of murders has not been known in London for 100 years. There is a bare possibility that it may turn out to be something like a case of Jekyll and Hyde, as Joseph Taylor, a perfectly reliable man who saw the suspected person on Saturday in a shabby dress, swears that he has seen the same man coming out of a lodging-house in Wilton Street very differently dressed. However that may be, the murders are certainly the most ghastly and mysterious known to English police history. What adds to the weird effect they exert on the London mind is the fact that they occur while everybody is talking about Mr. Mansfield's Jekyll and Hyde at the Lyceum. Punch magazine on September the 15th, in a brief article titled "A Serious Question," suggested that the garish adverts that were promoting the likes of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde might well have inspired the murderer. Is it not within the bounds of probability that to the highly coloured pictorial advertisements to be seen on almost all the hoardings in London, vividly sensational scenes of murder exhibited as the great attractions of certain dramas, the public may be to a certain extent indebted for the horrible crimes in Whitechapel? We say it most seriously. Imagine the effect of these gigantic pictures of violence and assassination by knife and pistol on the morbid imagination of unbalanced mind. These hideous picture posters are a blot on our civilization and a disgrace to the drama. Punch would return to this theme a month later with its October the 13th cartoon, Horrible London, or The Pandemonium of Posters. Those pictorial advertisements placarded all over London are indeed well calculated to upset morbid minds, the Aberdeen Free Press agreed. They are, to say the least, a public eyesore. It's a dangerous thing to play with blood, even in placards. The umpire, on Sunday the 16th of September, with its tongue firmly in its cheek, announced that the connection between the Whitechapel murder and the drama is not obvious, but the two have nevertheless been coupled. I am authorised to deny that the police suspect Mr. Hyde of having escaped from the Lyceum to do the deed. They did at first think they had a clue in this quarter, but this has now been abandoned in favour of another or others. The Western Daily Press on Monday, September the 17th, informed readers that Jekyll and Hyde continue to draw large audiences to the Lyceum and to disprove the predictions of the critics. The fact that the play is horrible is the secret of its popularity. London revels in horrors. The more morbid the theme, the greater its fascination. Such tragedies as the Whitechapel murders meet the popular fancy. In Hyde, a fearful monster in human form is portrayed. Women shudder at his apparition, yet they go and go again to gloat over an appalling spectacle. Hyde seems to be abroad in Whitechapel, and it may be reasonably asked, after all that can be said in support of the theatre, if the horrors of the stage really did not embody themselves outside. Certainly we are not improving in civilization, and the savagery of the criminal classes is growing. By the end of the month, such was the propensity of comparisons between Stevenson's and Mansfield's diabolical creation and real-life murderers, criminals and ne'er-do-wells that a correspondent felt compelled to write to the St. James's Gazette on Thursday the 27th of September to announce that he and a group of like-minded cultural thinkers had decided to launch a counter-offensive. You will be pleased, I am sure, to hear of a new society which is just being formed by a small but cultured body of thinkers in Highbury. It is called the Society for Preventing Any Further Allusions to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The name, I admit, is lengthy, but we cannot help that. The SPAJH will try to induce people, by moral suasion only, to refrain from comparing everybody they don't like to these two remarkable single gentlemen rolled into one. We shall work by means of lectures and gratis pamphlets, and a special mission is being organised for journalists. In their case, total abstinence is not recognised. We shall be satisfied if they will refrain from saying Mr. A or Lord B reminds us of the hero of Mr. Stevenson's powerful tale more than once a fortnight. Will you allow one of our travelling missionaries to wait on you? It has been suggested that as public horror at the Whitechapel murders increased, audience numbers began to decrease, and Mansfield was forced to close the play early as a result. In fact, that is not the case at all. From the outset, the run had been scheduled to end on the 29th of September, and on that day the last two performances took place at 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. However, its replacement, A Parisian Romance, met with disappointing audience numbers, and so, on the 4th of October, Mansfield announced that, in response to the continued and great demand for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the play would return to the Lyceum the following week with performances on Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 9 o'clock. This was at the time when people were reeling from the shock of the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes that had taken place in the early hours of Sunday the 30th of September, and yet Mansfield felt confident enough to bring the production back. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde wasn't, as is sometimes suggested, another victim of Jack the Ripper. The Daily Telegraph on Wednesday, October the 3rd, again pushed the idea that the perpetrator of the atrocities may have been influenced by Mansfield's performance. We continue to receive a vast amount of correspondence upon the subject of these appalling crimes. GC has a fancy that the perpetrator is a being whose diseased brain has been inflamed by witnessing the performance of the drama of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I understand is now wisely withdrawn from the stage. If there is anything in this, let the detectives consider how Mr. Hyde would have acted, for there may be a system in the demonic actions of a madman in following the patterns set before him. Comparisons between Hyde and Jack the Ripper continued into October. The Reverend Albert Hubule Evans wrote to the Standard on the 4th of October to proffer an opinion on the subject. When a man commits 4 separate murders in the same way, and on each occasion escapes without notice, the inference is irresistible that there is nothing whatever suspicious in his appearance. On the contrary, he is probably a man of most respectable exterior, calm and composed in manner, certainly dressed in dark clothes, wearing probably dark gloves, and possibly even a tall hat. He is probably a lonely, brooding monomaniac, well provided with money, occupying very likely a house by himself. Then at night he puts on his murder suit, lets himself out with the latchkey, does his deed of horror, and quietly returns home, none knowing when he went out or when he came back, or having any reason to suspect him. In conclusion, this is, I think, a case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in real life, suggested possibly to some diseased imagination by that very story. The murderer lives 2 lives and is saved from detection by the extreme respectability of his everyday life and by the fact that he has no accomplices or confidants. The next day, the City of London police received a letter that accused Mansfield of being the actual perpetrator of the crimes. In common with many of the Jack the Ripper letters, this missive was littered with spelling mistakes and bad grammar. It read, "Dear Sir, now that these horrible murders are being committed, I think it the duty of everyone to let the police know if they suspect anyone. What I am going to say seems almost impossible, but still strange things have happened at times. I have a great liking for actors, so that I should be the last to think because a man take a dreadful part he is therefore bad. But when I went to see Mr. Mansfield take the part of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I felt at once that he was the man wanted, and I have not been able to get this feeling out of my head. I thought it strange this play should have commenced before the murders, for it is really something after the same style. The murders take place on Saturday nights. Mr. M never has a performance on Saturday. The murders once took place on Friday, and once Mr. M was too ill to perform at the Saturday morning performance. I read in the Globe the other night that the same dreadful murders took place in America and were never discovered. Mr. M is, I think, American, but whether he came from there, I don't know." The writer then suggested that a watch should be kept on Mansfield, without causing any bother, before concluding, "I don't know what's put this into my head. I can assure you it is not because I see him take such a dreadful part, for I have friends on the stage take bad parts, but did not think they were bad in consequence. Yours, one who prays for the murderer to be caught, M.P." The Coleshill Chronicle on Saturday the 6th of October published details of an unfortunate incident that had befallen a man after attending a performance of Jekyll and Hyde. Between the Whitechapel murders and the weird performance of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the mental condition of people with highly strung nerves is becoming very serious. I was attracted by a crowd in the Strand the other night, and on investigating the matter, found that they surrounded a well-dressed young man who had bolted out of a bus while it was going at a rapid rate, and then fallen down in a fit. It appeared he had been to see Mr. Mansfield as Dr. Jekyll, and on getting into the bus found himself beside a most repulsive-looking man, whom he immediately concluded must either be the doctor himself or the Whitechapel murderer. In a fit of fearful nervousness, he jumped from his seat and came to grief, as mentioned. The Penny Illustrated paper on Saturday the 13th of October suggested that the police investigation into the crimes might benefit from the play's storyline and characters. Mr. Richard Mansfield, the exceedingly clever young actor who temporarily occupies Mr. Irving's place at the Lyceum, may be said by his wondrous performance of the parts of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the psychological drama of that name to have suggested a direction in which search might legitimately have been made for the Whitechapel ghouls, viz. In the direction of an apparently respectable man. Be that as it may, the rare histrionic ability of Mr. Mansfield calls for the publication of his portrait. Rather like the news programmes of today, the Victorian newspapers often turned to pundits who they hoped would provide an insight into the murderer's frame of mind for their readers' benefit. One authority who proved more than willing to offer an opinion was the alienist, neurologist and anatomist Dr. Edward C. Spitzka, the author of the landmark psychiatric manual Treatise on Insanity, its Classification, Diagnosis and Treatment, which had been published in 1883. The Bradford Daily Telegraph quoted him in its edition of Friday the 16th of November. It is probably a case of sexual perversion, what the old French writers called instinctive monomania. If this is so, the murderer is just as cunning and deliberate in his crimes as an able, sane man would be in doing meritorious acts, or as a forger or swindler would, perpetrating their lawless deeds. As a member of society he may express regret, but his conscience will not trouble him. He will very likely possess in a faint degree the moral qualities of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I should not be surprised if he was stimulated to commit these crimes by reading Mr. Stevenson's morbid and unhealthy story, which is likely to have a bad effect upon a previously morbid mind. Although the drawing of parallels between the murderer and Jekyll and Hyde lessened considerably in the second half of November, the debate continued as to whether violence in dramas, shilling-shockers and penny dreadfuls was helping fuel what elements of the press were now describing as the murder epidemic, whilst criticism of the posters used to advertise them remained high. In an editorial published on Wednesday the 19th of December, the Birmingham Mail, for example, was incensed that a provincial theatre company was using the Whitechapel murders to promote a production of the play. That the terrible Whitechapel atrocities should be made use of for theatrical advertisements seems impossible, but the following hideous puff preliminary has actually been issued by a provincial company playing a stage version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Whitechapel murders. Much has been said in the press about the impossibility of such a character as Mr. Hyde ever having existed. In effect, that the author's imagination had carried him too far away in the domain of fiction. The strange facts that have lately startled not only the metropolis but the whole world appear now to give some foundation for what a few weeks ago was thought so improbable. These wholesale murders, the handicraft most probably of a single human, though to all appearances demoniacal fiend, are fully realised in the strange story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was produced in London a few months ago, and on its appearance on the boards of the Lyceum Theatre created as much excitement as the sad reality is now causing throughout the world. By the side of this, the Mail fumed, the sensational pictorial posters to which so much objection has recently been taken certainly occupy second place. Thereafter, references to Jekyll and Hyde in relation to the Jack the Ripper crimes dwindled, and as 1889 dawned, almost all mentions of the characters were to do with either theatrical performances or reissues of Robert Louis Stevenson's original novella. Mansfield continued touring the country for the first 6 months of the year, but he returned to America in June 1889, by which time he was heavily in debt. Amongst his creditors was Henry Irving, to whom he owed over £2,000. He refused to pay on the grounds that Irving had not supported him adequately at the Lyceum. Irving sued, and in settlement was awarded the UK performing rights to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mansfield would never perform in England again. Here, then, as I lay down the cursor, I bring the saga of Richard Mansfield, Henry Jekyll, Edward Hyde and Jack the Ripper to an end. I hope you have enjoyed the video and that it has shone a light onto another aspect of this fascinating case. And now you must suffer me to go my own dark way. Cheerio.